Good evening, everyone. My name is Felicia Henry, and I am the founder of Behind the Walls, Between the Lines. Thank you so much for joining us tonight at the Disaster of Injustice, COVID Times Incarceration virtual series. Behind the Walls, Between the Lines is a movement to deepen the awareness of the legacy of racial inequity in America, particularly within carceral control, and inspire activism aimed at its dismantlement. So Behind the Wall uses spoken word, particularly and other artistic mediums as a platform to tell stories, to reclaim narratives, and activate the power of those who are directly impacted to catalyze change. Tonight's roundtable discussion of the Disaster of Injustice in COVID Times Incarceration virtual series is for the broader public. It's intended to bring together diverse voices, so directly impacted folks, scholars, disaster experts, advocates, to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on the carceral system and provide solutions inclusive of reform, decarceration, abolition, and community-based strategies like mutual aid and transformative justice to mitigate and or eliminate the harm to directly impacted individuals. I am so happy and so glad to be introducing the panelists for tonight. If you were there last week, you know that we have absolutely wonderful panelists who come to us from very diverse backgrounds and really are experts in the field, and tonight is no different. I want to introduce to you our two panelists for this evening, Dr. Dylan Rodriguez and Cheryl Wilkins. I am going to give you both, thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to give you both an opportunity to introduce yourselves. Cheryl, why don't you take the floor? Why don't you tell us who you are and what brings you to this work?
Okay. Hi, Felicia. So happy that, before COVID, you're back in New York and with us and working with us. Missed you. My name is Cheryl Wilkins. I'm co-founder and associate director of the Center for Justice at Columbia University, where we aim to transform a criminal justice system from one that is driven by punishment and retribution to one that is centered on prevention and healing. You know, we know and history shows that any movement that has ever been successful in this country has always had student and faculty engagement. But we also know that those that have lived experiences have their own set of expertise. And our aim is to bring these powerful entities together, and so that we can end this thing called mass incarceration.
Thank you so much. Dr. Dylan Rodriguez?
Yeah. First, let me say how thrilled and honored I am to be sharing the space with Cheryl and you, Felicia. And I'm especially happy to be on the East Coast, even if it has to be in a virtual format. I miss you, East Coast. I grew up on the East Coast. I grew up not too far from where you're doing your PhD degree. I grew up about an hour and a half from there in Northern Virginia, and I miss it. So I'm really happy just to be with you all in this way, especially talking about what we're talking about tonight. A brief introduction to me. I consider myself an abolitionist, teacher, scholar, writer, activist, thinker, doer, maker. I've been doing work. I explicitly identified with abolition for over 20 years. I'm a professor in the University of California system at the Riverside campus. I'm president of the American Studies Association through 2021. And my book just came out. My third book just came out called White Reconstruction, Domestic Warfare and the Logics of Genocide. I'm actually going to probably draw on some of the themes and arguments from that book in this conversation because it's so directly relevant. And other than that, I'm thrilled to be here. And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So you have heard already, as by way of introduction, we have two powerhouses for tonight's panel. And so I'm very, very happy that you both are here. So thank you so much again for accepting the invitation. And so I'm going to get right to it, kind of jump in the meat and potatoes of this conversation. And so this is called the Disaster of Injustice, COVID Times Incarceration virtual series. And for a lot of us, we are living in the time of COVID. We're understanding what's happening. We have, in a lot of ways, have either had very direct losses or, by proxy. And so we are feeling the effects of COVID-19. But for many of the folks in the general public, COVID-19 and incarceration are not in the same kind of thought process, right? Not in the same space. Actually, just now in New York State, the Elmira Correctional Facility has had a really, really intense outbreak of COVID-19. And we know that that is not necessarily just going to be limited to that facility and something that we're going to see. And so really the first question that I want to put out to the both of you is, why does this all matter? What is significant about the COVID-19 pandemic for incarcerated people? And Cheryl, I want to kick it to you first, because last week we had a panel of all men and just by happenstance. And one of the things that we didn't get to talk about is why it matters, why COVID-19 matters for incarcerated women and non-binary folks. And so I want to kick it to you first to talk about the significance of this pandemic from that perspective.
Right. All right. So what we know is that what this pandemic has done is exacerbated already existing problems. And so it's not like these things wasn't happening before. It's not like women weren't underrepresented, not talked about, forgotten about in this thing called mass incarceration. But now we bring, another set of issues as it relates to women in incarceration, because now we're bringing women in it who may be pregnant. Now we're bringing women in it who have kids. Now we're bringing women in it who have kids at home that they can't talk to. Why? Because I don't know about the rest of the country, but in New York State, there are corporations who are still benefiting off of the backs of those that are less fortunate and those that need the most support. And so, one question is, why is it that people have to pay for phone calls now anyway? Why is it that that you're not taking away any fines or restitution payments if families are out here struggling and what little they have? If you're able to send $25, then why do folks can only get $20 because the provider has to get $5 of that? These are things that make me believe that folks inside prison are throwaways. And so, you've lost all sense of humanity, and we don't really care about them. And so we're going to keep things going. Even on the outside, they had put a hold on people's phones, where you didn't have to pay the bill, or put a stay on people who had rent issues, who may have lost their jobs and any means of support. But inside, it seems like it just never stops. And, we have that punishment paradigm is just, just ruining this country, in a way that, listen, people have a prison sentence and we want to give them a life sentence. We know that prisons is a petri dish. How is it that you can have prisons inside, people inside prisons making hand sanitizers for people outside, but you can't have none. You know what I'm saying? We can't give you none. Oh, why? Because it has a little alcohol. Well, hell, during the earlier days of this pandemic, we all needed a glass of wine. Let's be clear. Let's be clear. And if somebody was drinking a little hand sanitizer to ease their nerves, then so be it. But to say that we remember what it means to be a woman inside prison, we don't. Prisons were not made for women. If we were, why did we have to get a bill passed that says, no, you can't shackle a woman while she's giving birth? Who does that? Clearly it wasn't a woman who passed that bill, I'm sure, because in no way that you can not understand that a woman giving birth is not going to escape at that moment. But I certainly get, the reasoning why, because if we're talking about predominantly Black and brown women, again, these are throwaways, in society's eyes, and we care little or nothing. I just can't imagine that if we were talking about predominantly white women, that this law would have been intact the way it is, or the way it was. And the way it's still happening now, let's be clear about that, even with a bill being passed, folks are still shackling women while giving birth and still putting chains around her stomach on the way to the hospital and things like that. Just barbaric stuff that happens to women inside, including, rape and abuse that happens with the guards. I'm a strong believer that there should be body cams. When officers pick up their walkie-talkie, they should pick up a body cam as well, because, I mean, just think about what's happening on the outside if we didn't have these body cams. Not that many things are happening to rectify the wrongdoing, because it's not, but at least we're seeing, America's on notice, and we see you, America, you know what I'm saying? And so that's not happening inside. That's the best kept secret. What's happening to folks inside, particularly women, most vulnerable. Yeah.
And I really appreciate you bringing up, you brought up a lot of different really good points. And I really appreciate the one that you ended on, because that kind of really undergirds this entire conversation, right? Like COVID-19 and the spread of COVID-19 behind bars is largely unknown, because there are no body cams, there are no cameras that kind of give us an insight into what is going on, right? There isn't that same level of access to prisons, to jail, to carceral facilities, immigration detention centers, as there is in the general public. And so one of the reasons why this conversation is so important, why your work is so important, both of you, is really shedding the light on what's actually happening on the inside and letting us know that this is not something that is new, right? This is a new pandemic, so to speak, but the issues that it's revealing and causing are not new. Dr. Rodriguez, I want to pivot to you and have you weigh in on this conversation. What's significant about the COVID-19 pandemic for incarcerated folks? Why does it matter?
So the short answer to your question is, what's significant is everything. Everything about this COVID-19 thing, something that we haven't seen in this place in at least a century, has a totality of effects that, to amplify what Cheryl was saying, they magnify already existing asymmetries of access to that which allows people to reproduce themselves as people and as communities, right? So that's going to get to my main point, which is to link how it is that the COVID-19 pandemic, as it's manifesting in sites of incarceration, is making very clear how the logic of incarceration is centrally premised on asymmetrical targeting of people under a logic of genocide. Meaning, in the case of COVID-19, meaning their exposure to preventable, avoidable illness and potential death. But just as importantly, I would argue, just as importantly, people's isolation and effective neutralization, meaning their removal from communities, their removal from family and affective and loving ties, their removal from meaningful relationships from with children, with cousins, with loved ones, with partners, and so forth and so on. That's all part of this larger logic that the carceral state, this thing that I'm going to call domestic warfare, right? I'm not going to call it mass incarceration anymore, because the people being incarcerated are not the mass. It's very clear who's being incarcerated. It's targeted, right? And by the way, I know that a lot of times when people say mass incarceration, what they're really talking about is mass Black incarceration, right? They're talking about in some geographies, targeted incarceration of Indigenous, Native people, maybe trans people, undocumented brown people crossing the border, and so forth and so on, right? But I just have a beef with the normalization of the phrase mass incarceration, because to me it's this sneaky backdoor way of saying all lives matter, right? And that's not where we're at, right? It's not a mass incarceration situation. We're talking about targeted carceral domestic warfare, and so what this means for me is that what COVID-19 does is it actually just clarifies what the existing normal logics are of this asymmetrical carceral war, right? Carceral just is a fancy word for incarceration, for entrapment, for state-conducted capture of people. That's all carceral means. And then to flip that on its head, and this is the thing that I find useful as a kind of exercise for people to walk through when I'm talking about this. What if we think about maximized exposure to disease and death as the normal state of things for people in incarcerated places, right? As something which COVID-19 maybe brings a kind of special clarity to, but which is actually just speaking to a normal state of things for people who are locked up, right? Exposure to disease, exposure to, for that matter, to disaster. Katrina was not that long ago, right? And what we saw when Hurricane Katrina went down is that people who were incarcerated were the first ones to be drowned, right? So that is the normal state of things. That's what warfare is. It's a normalization of targeted populations' exposure to disease, to illness, to suffering, to misery, to death, to separation from their communities. And that's to also say that this beast that we're dealing with, this beast that we have to abolish, is part of the long history of U.S. domestic war. So this is not something that just happened. It's not something that just happened in the last 50 years. It's actually the stuff of the United States in and of itself. That's why the abolitionist struggle, it's not just about abolishing the slave plantation or the frontier or the prison or the detention center, right? You're actually talking about a confrontation with the very thing that makes up the United States of America. And that's another way of saying, if what we're actually dealing with in this case, right, in the premise of our talking today, right, COVID times incarceration, right, COVID X incarceration, that's the theme of what we're talking about today. If we're actually going to deal with that, then what we're confronting is a logic of genocide. What do you do with a logic of genocide? Well, you definitely don't reform it, right? You don't try to policy fix it. You want to get rid of it. You stop that thing, right? You do whatever it takes to undermine and destroy that logic of genocide, because otherwise, you know, certain people, certain populations that you love and care about will not survive. And then the last thing I'll say, people inside are constantly telling us what's up, right? So I feel like I don't have any expertise in that. I feel like part of my role is I just take what I read and learn and hear by 1 and 2 degrees of separation from people who are locked up. You know, illicit cell phone calls, folks are Facebook messaging, people are leaving voicemails with each other. So folks who are incarcerated and detained and whatnot, they are constantly telling people on the outside what is going on, right? I think the role that all of us play is just to circulate those voices, to take them seriously. First of all, to circulate those voices and amplify them as much as we can in whatever ways we can. And then one more thing I'll say about the cams, right? I'm going to argue that we have to rely on our cams. That the fact is that the police are never going to hold themselves accountable, right? The state will probably, unless there's a complete takeover of the state will really not hold the police accountable. Body cams are one thing. I want to rely on our cams. I think the most important footage, the most important exposure and demystification of police violence, especially anti-Black police violence, has come from ordinary people, really like us, like our neighbors, like our kids, you know what I mean, like our elders, who got these things on them, right, and click them on. And there's nothing that is freaking the cops out nowadays more than people who are, in that sense, armed with a camera. So we got to have those cams. And at the same time, we got to be talking about self-defense, right? We can't talk one without the other. So we have the cams and we have self-defense. And I'm sorry I'm talking so much. I'll shut up for a second.
Yeah.
No, you're fine. Cheryl, go for it. I see that you have some.
One of the things that really frustrates me is the lack of transparency during this time. Like we are relying on state and federal systems to give us data, which we all know that data is scarce. And so, for us, just like Dylan said, that, we have to rely on folks inside who's telling us who's getting sick, what happened, did they put him back in his place? And so, yeah, for me, a formerly incarcerated woman, we had this theory when we were inside that at least let one person know your people's information, because if something happens to you, they will never know what really happens to you if you're going to rely on state and federal guards to tell that story. And so for me, I understand about us relying on our own cams and stuff, but what happens inside? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out, how do we break this ice where we could at least expose what's happening inside, because it's some horrific stuff that happens inside. And for me, being inside women's prison, there was not one prison that I was inside that I don't really have nightmares about right now. You know what I'm saying? And so how do we get these stories out to where it's not lied about and talked about with people who have a bigger platform than what we have is a thought.
Yeah, Dr. Rodriguez.
Yeah, no, what Cheryl's talking about here is terror.
Yeah.
Right. And this is why we got to use the language of war. Number one, because the state uses it. Those who are waging the war are unabashed. They are unapologetic about using the language of warfare. And I'm not just talking about the Trump administration. I'm talking about every state administration. Right. In various ways, they are explicitly, and they have been explicitly using the language of war. You know, for 200 plus years, they've explicitly used the language of war in talking about criminalizing and locking people up for all different kind of reasons, but Black people in particular, and in various geographies, other targeted populations, right? But Black folks have borne the brunt of that particular technology of the state, which is criminalization and then focused anti-Black terror, right? And when Cheryl speaks, that's what I'm hearing echoing over and over again, right? Is that you carry that shit with you, Cheryl. You know what I mean? And that's the thing, is it never actually goes away.
No.
So I feel like part of the abolitionist craft, in a way, maybe it's a creative dimension of this, is I think we need to stop compartmentalizing these stories as if they're just a bunch of collected incidents. Right. Because that's the language of the courts. Right. The courts want us to compartmentalize incidents of brutality, incidents of sexual violence. Right. Incident. And when I listen to people talk about it, they're not talking about incidents. They're talking about something that is thick, something that stays with them forever. Right. Something that becomes part of their body, something that, you know, haunts them every day. So I think part of the craft, I think, and that's why I think what you're doing, Felicia, is so important. Like, this is actually one way we do this. Part of the craft is to communicate and narrate the terror in a way that people can begin to access a piece of it, and also be, frankly, and I'm gonna say this, other people need to be terrified. They need to take some of that terror off your shoulders and off your soul, Cheryl. Yeah. Like, we need to be able to take some of that from you and feel it with you. And I feel like that's one of the practices that I slowly learned that. Right. Probably in my first 5 to 10 years trying to do, right, explicitly trying to do abolitionist work, right, where people thought I was crazy when I would use that term, because everybody was a reformist, everybody on policy change. I was like, no, I'm an abolitionist. I don't think this is something that we should be messing around with. I think we need to find ways to actually, and what animated me were all these stories and feelings that incarcerated people, like friends of mine that I would visit and stuff, would share with me, that's what it was, right? And I didn't get my head around what terror is in that context for a long time, but now I feel like I have like, what do you call it? It's like ESL. It's like a second language, right? It's not my primary language, but I feel like I've been around so many people that speak this language of terror that I can feel it and understand it when people speak it. You know, because I've not been incarcerated, right? But I've been around enough communities and of people and individual people who've been incarcerated that I feel like I have a secondary fluency in understanding when that's there. And it's forced me to appreciate how central the terror is to what the state is doing. So it's not just the locking up part, right? It's everything that goes down there and the way it's supposed to follow you when you're not incarcerated anymore.
Yeah, I agree with you, sir. And again, I'm talking about, you know, you get moved around on a prison sentence, and each of the prisons was no different at all. You still had, to put it in terms of what you're saying, you still had that amount of terror. And for us, we had that amount of fear.
Right.
You know, and so you learn to navigate and maneuver around this, but how could you maneuver around what's inside of you and what you're feeling? Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, that's just your body moving and getting out of the way, but your heart and soul is in it, and it's hard. Yeah.
And I really appreciate what both of you are bringing up, because what it does is frames the conversation. So when we're talking about COVID-19 and incarceration, we're framing the conversation not as here is one experience or one issue next to another issue, right? This is not just two issues coming together. This is like a manifold of issues and systems that are coming together, right? So when we're talking about COVID and incarceration, we're talking about the intersections of systems that have either failed and or specifically targeted specific communities, right? So when we're talking about communities of color and their access to socioeconomic mobility, when we're talking about access to healthcare, when we're talking about where they're geographically located, right? Even when we're talking about disasters, if we talk about the kinds of communities that are most at risk of exposures and hazards, we're still talking about the very marginalized and oppressed communities that have been that way for decades, for centuries, right? And so I think what's really important about what both of you are saying is we cannot look at what's happening behind bars with COVID-19 as an isolated experience. Neither can we look at it as a 2020 experience, right? We have to link it into these larger systems of violence that have been around. And so to that end, to kind of this linking of violence, I want to talk a little bit about kind of stepping back away from specifically COVID-19 and incarceration, but how does this, what we're talking about, what we're experiencing, tie into these calls for defunding the police, for abolition of policing systems? Like, what is the tie? Is there a tie? And what is that tie as it relates to incarceration, COVID-19, and those kind of calls that we're seeing right now?
I think that we know that what keeps communities safe is not extra policing. It's not putting more money into corrections. It's healthcare systems in the community. It's jobs. It's better housing. It's caring for single mothers. If you take 1 in 3 Black men out of my community and you leave a woman to fend for themselves, what kind of support are you giving that family, to stay together? Or are you just going to do some study and say, yeah, if that parent goes to prison, then the kid is likely to go to prison? No, not if you support that family and try to hold them together. And so I think that we have to get out of the idea from starting. First of all, we are Band-Aid society. And, we do not look on the front end of nothing when it concerns, our community, but we do look on the front end of things when it concerns the 1%, because the preparation from birth is there to be this great citizen. But we don't have that kind of support. And so if we're not doing it before, it doesn't take, people don't even understand this who don't come from areas in which we come from. It doesn't take much for a person to get stopped and arrested. It doesn't take much. This driving around Black is real. Just walking down the street with two other friends is real. You're going to get stopped. And so once you start to build that up, and the criminal record comes into play, and it makes me mad even around this time, because then that starts to knock, our future leaders out of the political race, because of all of the arrests they may have, minor offenses, but build into something bigger if you get enough of them. And so, yeah, just looking at, how the deck is stacked against us in our communities at birth, with not even caring of giving better healthcare systems. I'm just sick of every time something goes wrong in our country, we are the most likely to die. We are the most likely to go to prison. We are the most likely to get all of this negative stuff about us, that's happening with us. And there's a reason why, because we are less valued, and for being a Black woman in America is exhausting. It's exhausting. Because I'll peel back all those layers, then you're going to find us, coming from the bottom up, just to try to have a breakthrough. And so, I just feel that, in this time of COVID, it's uncovering and pulling back some covers, but it was already there. You know what I'm saying? And we just have an opportunity, just like to use this moment to try to capture something that was already there, but anybody who is lived in our skin understands that, hey, this was already happening, so now you see it. So.
And I'll just add to that. I want people to just absorb how much it's taken to push a significant number of people toward the abolitionist or abolition friendly model, right? At its best, defunding is abolition friendly. At its worst, it's a work of white magic. It's a deception, right? So like defunding means a whole bunch of different stuff. We can get into a whole politics and debate like what people really mean when they say that. But when we say police abolition, we're a little bit more clear. What we're saying is that this is a system that cannot be reconciled with particular people's communities' safety, right? With their notions of security. And I think what's important to reflect on in 2020 is just how much it's taken to push a significant number of people toward that position. And when I say how much it's taken, I'm not just talking about how much police violence against Black folks we've needed to see. I'm also talking about the mobilizations of people in communities in the street for mutual aid, right? For rebellion, for destroying this kind of religious valorization that the society has for the police, just ruining that, right? Think about how much work and how much risk and how much vulnerability people and communities have had to put themselves in just to get a significant number of us to the point where we're recognizing that maybe the system actually needs to be completely abolished and transformed, right? So by saying that, what I'm saying is that there's a necessity to honoring the longer history to which all that work is attached, and that is a humbling thing. I'll say that that's the first lesson I learned getting into this work as a teacher, as a scholar, as an activist, right? Is I was in rooms with people who had been doing on the ground, grassroots, liberationist oriented work, abolitionist oriented work for decades, right? And I was the dumbest person in the room. I was an apprentice and an assistant. I had to learn everything from these folks, from the wisdom and from the experience. I still feel like that in a lot of ways. I get called on to talk about it with some level of expertise. It's not really expertise, it's more experience, right? It's some level of like qualified wisdom I might have from just having been through it. But I still feel the same way, right? I'm still picking stuff up from people like you, like you, Felicia. You share. I'm still picking stuff up from you all the time, to kind of inform that journey and that struggle, that everyday practice. So when we think about how this condition of COVID-19 incarceration ties into these emerging demands to defund the police as well as to abolish the police, what I think people are recognizing is that there is at best a fabricated relationship between safety and policing, right? There's a decoupling that's happening where police are no longer necessarily predominantly understood to be there to protect you, whoever the you is, right? Or at worst, they're not there to protect somebody I care about, right? That if I'm white, if I'm in the suburbs, maybe the police will respond to me in a different way. But what matters to me more is understanding how I'm on the historical record right now, and I have to pick a side, right? Because the police are a warfare apparatus. What side do I pick? I'll tell you all that sometimes you have to pitch things in those terms, right? You have to remind people you're on the historical record. I recently finished my 2 terms as the chair of the academic senate at my campus. And one of the meetings that we had in the University of California system, where all the different chairs of academic senates met, we were actually a couple of us, the wild-eyed abolitionists in the room, literally 2 of us out of like 20. We called on the larger UC Senate to respond to the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor uprisings, right? We said this calls on us as educators in the University of California, public institute. We got to respond to this. And you got the wishy-washy white liberalism. You got the neoconservative pro-police law and order people, and they were ready to not pass the statement that we had written, right? And it got to that point where I had to, and it was all pivoting around white fear, around the potential call for defunding and abolishing the police, right? They felt their safety, their existence was at stake. And here's the thing, it actually is, right? because white existence is based on this asymmetrical unilateral warfare that the police wage. So yes, white people, your existence actually is at stake. I will say that, right? So at the same time, what I was telling this room full of white colleagues is, at a certain point, I tell them, I really don't care if you sign the statement or not at this point, right? Because I'm going to sign it. And if y'all don't sign it, I can guarantee you, I will go around to anyone that was listening, and I'm going to let them know who did not sign it, right? And all of a sudden, they felt like they had to sign it, right? Because they're animated by cowardice, right? So part of what's unfair about all this is that the burden of courage falls on those of us who are willing to embrace the abolitionist obligation. The hope is that enough folks around us will get encouraged into embracing the obligation to at least get out of the way, right? Because you don't necessarily need a mass movement of millions of people to change the world, right? What you need is committed groups of people who have a good analysis, who have a good strategy, and know how to get at systems of power in ways that are confrontational and indelible, ways that cannot be assimilated. And the last thing I'll do is I want to quote Dr. Armin Henderson from the Dream Defenders down in Florida. He's a Black doctor based there in the Miami area. He was well known for a period of time because he was doing some community-based work for homeless folks trying to do COVID testing, and the cops arrested him in front of his own house, in front of his own condo, when he was loading a van with medical materials. He got detained in front of his own house, in front of his significant other and his children, because they thought he was homeless and all this. And you know the story, right? Like, this is an old story. And what Dr. Henderson was talking about in this conversation I had with him, he was reflecting on the effect that this situation, meaning the uprisings against the police, had on fellow doctors when combined with the COVID-19 pandemic. And what he found interesting was that he said his fellow doctors who were not inclined to be pushing for defunding or abolishing the police, right? But they were inclined to try to figure out what the hell to do about COVID, right? So they were inhabiting this weird tension. What Dr. Henderson was saying is that his fellow doctors were caught in this irreconcilable contradiction between their expectations for what they thought the state should do, right? How the state's supposed to be this caretaking thing. The police are supposed to make sure people are safe and all this stuff. And yet this is in that April and May period. And yet all his fellow doctors were watching the breakdown of the state all around them in real time. Right. And he said it messed those doctors up irreparably. They will never be the same. I don't care how they vote, right? The point is they will never be the same because as he put it, those doctors under those conditions, they realize they are no different than somebody who is working at McDonald's. Mm-hmm. Right. You know how we always do that, right? All of us bougie middle class people, I guilty. I do it to my kids every now and then too, right? It's like, you want to work at McDonald's the rest of your life? It's like, well, shoot, man. I mean, these doctors were getting paid a lot more, but they're being treated the same way that a worker would be treated under harsh conditions because the state did not give a shit about them. The state didn't care about them. They didn't care if they lived or died. They were service workers at the disposal of the state. And so that's part of this breakdown that we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, I think the situation we're in with all this stuff converging is pushing people toward that same kind of irreconcilable confrontation with policing, right? Knowing that we can't keep doing this reform dance because it's a deadly dance. It's a self-destructive dance.
Yeah, and I love that because I think you're really spot on, right? I think that there's a lot of people, and to one degree, right, we know that some people are in some ways just taking it for themselves, and there are a lot of definitions out there, and some people are not actually really committed to the actual principles of what we're talking about, right? When we're talking about abolition, when we're talking about defunding in the way that we need to. So we know that some of those things have been co-opted, but I think it is really, really interesting to see such large groups of people, so many people start to embrace these things more and more because they are seeing that breakdown of the state, right? They are seeing like, wait a minute, hold on, now that I am in this vulnerable situation, COVID-19 is happening, I'm seeing these police killings, I'm seeing all of these things coming together at the same time. Yeah. And I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on? Where am I? I thought this was supposed to happen. I thought this was supposed to happen, and it's not happening. And I love that because really what folks are seeing is like you're starting to get a taste or an experience of what folks have been looking at and experiencing for a really long time, right? There are some communities who it's not a new thing. It's not a way for them to jump on the bandwagon now. They've been calling for these things for a really long time. And so I think that it's really critical to see that there are more people gathering. But I also love the fact that both of you, Cheryl, kind of brought up the very practical day-to-day experiences, and then you brought up the more systemic linkages. But as we're talking about incarceration and we're talking about policing, I think that point about the historical record is really important, right? Because I think what will end up happening if we don't link these things back to the larger systems, if we don't link these things back to their foundations and their origins, then we run the risk of making it a bad apples versus good apples conversation, or we run the risk of making it a violent offender versus a non-violent offender kind of situation, or we make it. And so I think that it's really important to understand, like, what is the foundation of policing in this country, right? What is the foundation of incarceration in this country? Who are the populations that we're talking about that are being held in these facilities during a pandemic? Why are these populations there, right? So it's not enough just to say, oh, incarceration is disproportionately impacting Black folks or brown folks. That's not enough, right? We need to go past that and say, okay, and then why though? Why is this happening? And how do we reconcile that with the fact that these systems are supposed to do either safety or rehabilitation and those things? And so I think that that's a really important, incarceration in terms of the front door, we're talking about police contact, right? Exactly what Cheryl was talking about earlier. We're talking about, driving while Black, walking by Black, breathing while Black, right? We're talking about these things where folks that would normally just be living their lives, right? We're talking about a Black erasure in a lot of ways, living their lives, and are caught into the system and then kind of transported along that way. So I'm really happy that we're talking about these linkages, these larger linkages, because I think that they're really critical in what we're understanding right now. You both have said it already a couple of times about COVID-19 really exacerbating and really laying bare what's going on. But I want it to be clear that we have to back it up and understand what were those things before? What were those conditions before? What were the systems that were actually in place and in play before? So I'm really glad that both of you brought that up. Dr. Rodriguez, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's as with anything, it's a complex interaction of multiple kinds of historical systems, right? So we got to say that out front. And I'll say that to get a real deep understanding of this, I think it's important to share sustained conversation about it. It's not something that's easily taken in a soundbite, right? And in fact, the kind of soundbite responses to complicated questions are part of our problem right now. It's especially part of the problem with how it is that we run the risk of certain adaptations of this thing we're calling abolition are very quickly turned into progressive reformist responses and not abolition in the tradition primarily of Black radicalism and Black revolutionary struggle, and linked to other forms of revolutionary and anti-colonial struggle, right? So if we think about this in a complex way, we have to come to terms with some key ideas, right? The first, and arguably one of the foremost, if not the foremost, is this concept that people have been raising in recent years called racial capitalism, right? And so it's a term that the late great Black radical thinker Cedric Robinson thought through extensively in his book Black Marxism, right? Published in the early 80s, and which has undertaken a renaissance in the last 15 years, appropriately so, although belatedly so. And I'll just say one thing about that concept, which is this notion that what Robinson's arguing is that the precursors for what we understand to be at this moment, racism, anti-Blackness, white supremacy, all those forms of racially structured and particularly anti-Black forms of violence are not peripheral to capitalism, right? They're not simply tools that the white owning class uses to divide and conquer, which has tended to be a kind of classical Marxist class-focused story of how to defeat racism. It's like, okay, we just got to stop being divide and conquer. What Robinson's arguing in racial capitalism is that all that violence, all that intertribal, racial, anti-Black colonial violence is actually the condition through which capitalism emerges and constantly reproduces. So all this shit that we're going through in these last 4 years under this administration in really profound, spectacular ways. Number one, they're not that different than what we went through under 8 years of Obama, okay? Like in many ways, it seems that it is, right? But if you get right down to brass tacks, it's more of a continuity than a rupture between those things. I want to provoke people at times and say I feel like sometimes Barack Obama and Donald Trump are these illegitimate cousins, right? Because there's a lot more in common between them than not. Personalities aside, rhetoric aside, one person being a jerk and one person being respectable and dignified aside, putting that aside. But it's to say that we can't be thinking about one causality, right? One source of primary oppression that determines everything else. That's what Cedric Robinson teaches us when he says racial capitalism. That violence that we see is actually, it's inseparable. It is the engine of capitalism, right? It's not just the market. It's not just rational choice. It's not just, how do I make the most profit with paying labor the least? It's actually that animus, that violence, that conquest is actually the central part of the picture. If we understand that, I think we can get our heads around where it is that this thing that I'm trying to call carceral warfare has come from. That it is simultaneously a response to the crises of capitalism in the late 20th century, but it is inseparably a manifestation of that violence, particularly anti-Black violence, right? Geographically focused warfare against Black people. So those two things are inseparable. So I'll say, but that's one piece of the equation. But I think it's important for folks that are watching us, listening to us, to just kind of try to get their heads around that.
Yeah, and I love that, right? Because I think that it is a complicated kind of equation to look at, right? There is no single answer. There is no single solution. There is no single response, because we're dealing with legacies of systems that are all interconnected and depend on one another in a lot of ways, right? So when I think about Patricia Hill Collins, or I think about Kimberly Crenshaw, and I think about the matrix of domination, and I think about intersectionality, I think about those arguments and then apply them, more largely to these systems when I'm saying like, hey, wait a minute, we're not just talking about racism. We're not just talking about patriarchy. We're not just talking about capitalism. We're talking about the ways that these things intersect for not just an identity, but also for a way of existence, right? So we're talking about, when Cheryl was talking earlier, about women and non-binary folks that are incarcerated in women's prisons. We're not just talking about what it is to just be a woman in prison, right? We're talking about the intersection of what it means to be a Black woman, a Latina woman. We're talking about the intersections of what it means to be a woman and also a poor woman, or we're talking about intersections of being a woman with children. There are so many intersections that all need to, which really essentially bring us to the fact that there is going to be no one solution to that kind of experience, because it is really all intersected. Cheryl, I want to bring you in here and just have you talk a little bit about, talk a little bit more about this experience for women. And I know that you've been in contact with folks, with women that are locked up now, and just kind of bring them into this conversation, because I know that you really, it's really important for you to center their voices. So
absolutely,
I just want to kick it to you.
Yeah. So before I move on, I just want to say that, the systems that we're talking about, they've had opportunities to refine this for years and years and years and build on what we now are experiencing. And so, for us to, think about, how long we've been fighting against this, it's not as long of a time than it was to be built and to build them on top of this, and so, if we're talking about women, yes, some of the horrific hangings from our ancestors, were women, in slavery. And, again, even back then, that doesn't get as much talked about, as it should. And in addition to the strength of women, it's just, in the last few years that we are looking at folks where we could, quote unquote, give them their flowers now, because it's usually that they died, and then you'll learn more about how powerful these women were in the movement and things like that. And so, what makes me happy now is that, even with the Black Lives Matter movement, Black Lives Matter movement, it's a group of women that's coming together and standing up and not behind a man. No offense, Dr. Rodriguez.
None taken.
Yeah, we kind of feel that if a woman was in the White House right now, that it would be a lot of change, because we would be just that focused and together and that nurturing and coming from a place of trying to heal this country as opposed to polarize it the way it is. And so even when we're talking about a woman inside, yeah, there's some movements inside. There's some organizing right now that's happening inside where women are trying to make changes, no longer waiting till you get out, even though you have your head in the lion's mouth. I mean, we're looking at the marches right now. People are fed up, and they, quite frankly, they don't have anything to lose, is what the feeling is, and that relates also to women who are inside, particularly when you see their kids not being taken care of or family members being abused, and you're inside prison yourself. It's not much that you won't do for your family, but at the same time, you fed up. I mean, and that's what we are as people, and particularly women inside prison, I feel, at this point. Yeah.
Dr. Rodriguez,
Yeah, I would just add to this that, listening to Cheryl makes me, recall how central feminist, queer, and trans people, activists, organizers, scholars have been over the last 20 plus years in laying the foundation for abolitionist work that have made it possible to articulate it in 2020. The rooms I was in with folks, with the folks I was learning from, debating with, and building, constructing things with, it was overwhelmingly feminist women and queer and trans people, including former political prisoners, formerly incarcerated people. Every now and then, actually currently incarcerated people would find a way to be involved. So if it wasn't for people like Angela Davis, Rachel Herzing, who's now running the Center for Political Education in the Bay Area, Melissa Birch, who's a professor now at University of Michigan and was for a long time one of the principal organizers of Critical Resistance, and was working with Susan Burton over there in South Central LA. Rita Bo Brown was part of the white trans person who was part of the George Jackson Brigade, a revolutionary underground organization in the state of Washington, right? Who was a political prisoner for a minute. I mean, these are just 4 examples of people, but these are folks who kind of created the possibility for me to even be here to talk like this, because these were my teachers, my colleagues, and my fellow suspects in a way. So I think this is part of that same continuity. Is we have to understand how it is that the response that feminist, queer, and trans people have had as abolitionists over the last 20 plus years has actually been the central animating force of all this. And I think what it does is it demystifies this I think deeply anti-Black and misogynist notion that radical movements are inherently masculine or masculinist, right? That they're inherently misogynist and sexist and patriarchal, and that they're inherently led by dudes. This last 20 plus years of abolitionist work has completely disrupted that in ways that I think, those of us that have been in it and are even just paying attention to it, you can't go back to those old models. Yeah. Right. I mean, I'm not saying there's not still struggle and internal conflict and all that. That's all part of it. But I'm saying that kind of old, tired model does not have any traction. And so I can say I'm privileged to be part of that community of people.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that you brought that up, because when we even think about a lot of I remember shortly after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and by the way, Cheryl, I'm really glad that you brought that up when you were talking earlier too, because it's really easy for us to rattle off the names of Black men who have been killed by state-sponsored violence, have been killed by the police, and quite hard for us to think about the women, right? So we know Breonna Taylor. We say her name and we're like, yeah, she's been killed by police violence, but we can't actually bring up the names of all of the other women who are so many, all of the other women who have also been affected by that violence, right? And so even when we think about COVID and incarceration, one of the reasons why I love the fact that you're on the panel is because we need to center the voices of folks that are marginalized within these systems of oppression, right? So like, we're not just talking about, although the numbers themselves might be larger, we're still talking about populations of people who are inside whose rates are growing exponentially by the hundreds, right? Year by year. We're talking about people who it doesn't really matter whether or not their population is, a fraction of the larger population, they're still experiencing that, right? So I'm really appreciative of bringing that up because I think it all really ties in. The invisibility of Black women and other women, trans women who have been killed by the police really translates itself into the invisibility of those folks when we're talking about incarceration, when we're talking about behind the bars.
Yeah.
And I also, go for it.
I was also thinking, and not to lessen the effects of what happened to our brother George Floyd, but even with Breonna Taylor, I mean, her case didn't even get looked at until after George Floyd, and her situation, her murder happened before. And so, that's just an example. I mean, a sister in Rockland County in New York, Tina Davis, she was tasered to death while handcuffed. And we're just trying to get her story out there. And we understand why it's not getting out there, because she suffered from mental illness and she had a criminal justice record. But the fact of the matter is, she was tasered to death while handcuffed. We can't skip that portion of it. And so, we as a society, we do not look at the murders of women the way we should, in my eyes. I mean, because of for whatever reason. I mean, even if you talk about who's in prison right now, you would never put women. The women are the fastest growing population to enter the prison system. You'll always put the amount of men first, and so it's just horrible to think about the value that we put on our sisters, our queens, and somebody we as a society should be uplifting and protecting.
Yeah, exactly right. And even when we think about, back to Dr. Rodriguez's early point where we were talking about, leaders of the abolitionist movement, even if we go back to anti-lynching, right? All the way back to anti-lynching, we're talking about Black women, women of color leading those movements, right? We're talking about when we think about Ella Baker, for example, like there are so many, ways that women, Black women in particular, have been erased from the narratives around, abolition or around civil rights or around these kind of, the struggles, revolutionary struggles. And I think that, again, it just kind of really goes back to this earlier point that when we're talking about oppression, when we're talking about these systems that are violent, we're not just talking about one, we're talking about the intersection of many that then lead to the invisibility of, the specific folks that these systems are targeting. And I just really appreciate this conversation because I think that we're bringing that into this space, right? We're bringing the complexity, we're bringing the intersections of these systems, we're bringing that these experiences, again, are not just one-fold, they're many-fold, very dimensional, they're dynamic. And so when we're thinking about how COVID is spreading behind bars, it's not just the numbers, it's not just how many people are positive and how many people die. We're talking about why is it that folks inside already have poor healthcare in the first place, right? We're talking about ways that their vulnerability is increased because of where they are, right? So I think that that's really important. Dr. Rodriguez, yes.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, well, first of all, let me correct myself. Rita Bowe Brown does not identify as trans. Rita Bowe Brown identifies as a butch, badass lesbian who the state misgendered. The state misgendered Bowe when she was part of the brigade because she has a full goatee. So they kept calling her the gentleman bank robber because she was so polite when she would engage in their activities. So I did not mean to do that to Bowe, and Bowe needs our help right now. So I'm going to put a GoFundMe in the chat if you let me. We got to take care of Bowe in her last years on this register of so as far as thinking about where we're at with COVID-19 and incarceration, you all made me think about another possibility that I think we can. Well, I think we're obligated to press on it for specific reasons, and that is decarceration. Part of, and this is like where there's potentially some uneasy, messy interaction that those of us who are struggling to do abolitionist work might be able to have with liberals who are almost always on the other side of things, right? a lot of the liberal progressive side is advocating release of certain categories of incarcerated people who are COVID positive. There's a point of leverage there, right? Because if we pay really close attention and are skillful about how we listen to the rationales that liberals and progressives give for releasing COVID positive incarcerated people, that is very, in my view, that is very quickly translated into a generalized case for abolition, meaning a generalized case for decarcerating people, period, end of sentence. That's the kind of skill set and I think daring that we need to embrace all the time. And I say it means you got to swallow something too, because you're going to be talking to people who you're used to yelling at them or cussing them out under your breath, or maybe out loud too. But I think this is where things are at. They're what human created disaster and disease does, what contagion does, is it kind of calls the hand of people who want to play the middle ground all the time, right? And it calls the hand of those who want to hierarchically rank who deserves a chance at being alive and who probably should be left for dead, right? All that virtue signaling, that moral grandstanding, and all the rest of that stuff, right? That stuff can actually get called out in some real direct ways in this moment. And what it does is it actually implicates people who don't want to identify with the abolition tag as actually being wrapped up in a potentially abolition-friendly logic. Decarceration is abolition-friendly, people. You know what I mean? Now, we can fight about your choice, right? How you formulate your choice for who should be decarcerated, like, and we will fight about that. But the fact that the premise of the conversation has shifted to talk about who it is that should be released from prison, right? Not by virtue of their innocence, not by virtue of an unfair trial or whatever it might be, not by virtue of any of that, but by virtue of some kind of claim to life, right? To integrity, to access to some version of humanity, whatever you want to call humanity at this point. That is stuff that we can and should seize on, because it's an indication that all the work that a lot of us have been doing for many years has gained enough traction that even the liberals are doing this at this point, right? In their own weird, halting ways, but we can seize on that and push and push and push on it. And that's the moment we're in. I think we're obligated to do that as one part of the rest of the work. I mean, that's just one fraction of it.
Mm-hmm. That's a great segue into kind of my final question for you both is, what are the strategies, the solutions, the considerations that we should have as we're thinking about COVID-19 and incarceration? And we're talking about like really the models, the frameworks, the approaches, like what do we put on the table? And I think decarceration is one of, the top strategies that we need to be considering right now, right? Let people out, period. Because I think that a lot of us think like, oh no, but if they're locked up, then they should be locked up for a reason. They were, they did some crime and they should stay there, and all of these kind of things. But what you're talking about is this sense that we don't have time for that, right? When we're seeing the spread of this virus, we don't have time to get into the nitty gritty about, okay, well, is this a violent offender versus violent offender? And I know that there are some kind of breakdowns with that going on, but I think people are starting to realize that there is no other alternative, no safer alternative to stop the spread of COVID-19 behind bars than to let people go, right? Because if we're talking about reducing capacity at restaurants, when we're talking about reducing capacity at schools, when we're talking about hybrid learning models, right? So you go into the classroom some days and you don't go into the classroom some days, or we're still social distancing and wearing masks and all of these kind of things. If we're still taking these protocols and even, the positivity rate get a little bit too high, we're shutting down again. And so when we're thinking about these kinds of, considerations or these measurements outside, when we're talking about the general public, those are the very same things that we should be applying to folks that are on the inside, right? Why are certain jail and prison and detention facilities still at capacity or over capacity when we are saying the same, we're saying something different for different kinds of facilities that are non-carceral. So I love the fact that we're putting decarceration on the table, because I absolutely think that it is something that we should be pressing for, pushing for, and, really in a lot of ways, getting people out of the middle ground. There is no middle ground when it comes to this, right?
Yeah. So I think, what this time has done is brought different groups together. You know, it's definitely, you know, our end goal is the same. You know what I'm saying? So, and whether folks are looking to release aging people versus women versus state and fed, you know, what I found is that we are all coming together at this point because we need each other, you know, and so, you know, it's been wonderful to witness in many ways of the different rallies and the letters going to different governors and uh, the fight with different mayors and things like that, and campaigns that are going on where there is a sense of urgency, like you said, Felicia, to, you know, to just to get folks out, you know, and so, you know, the way you do it is less important at this point, and let's just do it, you know, and so that's what's happening now in the movements that I'm involved in. Yeah.
And I'll just add that we need to be attentive to how the lessons that currently and formerly incarcerated people have been trying to teach organized activists and teachers on in the so-called free world for many years takes special significance now. And the lesson is this, and I was taught this very quickly when I started engaging with this work. Formerly and currently incarcerated people would tell me that a lot of anti-prison abolitionist activists had it wrong when they thought about incarceration being the place where the worst logics of the free world came to bear, right? And it's an old model that comes from Dostoevsky, the famous writer, right? This notion that, yeah, you judge a society by how it treats its incarcerated people, whatever. They said that's wrong. They said what people in the so-called free world need to understand is that the logics of violence, of state violence that happen in prisons, jails, and detention centers is the model for how the state and other powerful people run the free world, right? It's not the other way around, right? It's not that prisons and jails are the worst of it. Prisons and jails are the blueprint for the rest of it.
Right.
And so we see that when stuff like COVID-19 goes down. And I'll share with you all an anecdote that I think actually in a really interesting way meshes with this discussion we're having about COVID-19 in prison and jails. When I and others in the faculty at UC Riverside were in ongoing conversations with the administration through the summer about the possibility of a partial or, for that matter, total reopening of the campus in the fall. And I'll be clear that the people who represent the faculty senate were 100% against it, right? 100% against it. I mean, there was no ambivalence or ambiguity about it. But the administration was trying to push for some kind of partial reopening because they wanted students' butts in seats, right? Because they're competing for enrollment numbers and all this kind of like really economically driven stuff. Mm-hmm. A colleague of mine at a meeting that I unfortunately missed, but actually it's good I missed it because I think they were there substituting for me, right? But what I found out later, a colleague of mine asked the administrators in the room point blank, and they said, all right, if y'all want to do this hybrid reopening model, if you want to bring students back to campus, they said, what is the threshold of infections and deaths among students, faculty, and staff before you shut this thing down again, right? And here's the thing about asking that question. None of those administrators were prepared with an answer. Which was the answer? The fact that they had no response to that question was the answer. And so I keep coming back to that moment all the time, because if you translate that non-response into all these other places that we're talking about, right? Because everywhere, COVID-19 is everywhere. It is everything. If we translate that scene to all these other places, then we can kind of get at what the logic of power that we're dealing with actually is. Right. But I mean, including and especially prisons, jails, detention centers.
Absolutely. And it is that question, right, that we have to keep kind of putting on the table, especially when it relates to incarceration, because what are we okay with, right? Like, what are we okay with? What level of violence, what level of death, what level of infection, what level of suffering are we okay with before we say, actually, let's do something about it, right? And I think that that's really profound, because what it does, again, is forces people out of that middle ground to make a decision, to say, you know what, I have been on this side of the camp, or I've been really opposing this, but when I sit down with it and I see 9 million people in the United States alone having COVID, and when I see over 200,000 people alone dying from COVID, I have to start kind of thinking like, wait a minute, what am I okay with? And actually, no, I'm not okay with it, even so behind bars, right? And so I think that that's really critical for us to start asking that question, and for us to start posing that question, like your anecdote, like for us to start posing that question to folks that have that kind of power to make decisions. And so I wanna kind of just give some space for any closing thoughts, some closing kind of comments for either of you. Cheryl, I want to hand the floor over to you for some closing thoughts.
So, what's on my mind now is just identifying what is violent, because we have this idea of violence, basically, killing our brothers and sisters. But, I would argue and say it's violent when you don't give women enough sanitary napkins. It's violent when a person can't reach their family by phone. All of these things are forms of violence in a way that, we aren't talking about, but it is, and so, violence doesn't always have to be physical or death. That emotional violence is as strong, and so, if we look at it in terms of that, then, these are things that we should be fighting against as well, because it is a form of violence, not to be able to check on your loved ones. That's violence itself. Yeah.
And as far as closing thoughts go, I'll say to anyone who hears us on this, I think now is, I mean, we've been saying it, that this is not the time to be kind of hemming and hawing in some kind of middle ground somewhere. This is not the time for that. This is one of those rare historical moments where you have an opportunity to be part of the historical record in a profoundly transformative way, right? And no longer be a kind of passive witness to history. You actually have an opportunity to do this. Now is the time to embrace and be open about being or becoming an abolitionist in what you do, right? There's no special litmus test. You know what I mean? There's no conversion process. There's no dogma you have to attach yourself to. It is most importantly an unapologetic identification with liberation struggle. In the age of internet access and smartphones and whatnot, it is very, very easy to get a hold of materials that will help you get familiar with the different kinds of historical commitments and obligations that come with calling oneself an abolitionist. I say do that, embrace it, do it without apology, do it with generosity, do it collectively if you possibly can. If you can bring other people into these conversations, do it with grace, because it's a creative experiment. Abolition struggle is a creative experiment, but it's a committed collective experiment. And I'll say two more things. Mutual aid, something I've learned to appreciate in the last 7+ months is how central mutual aid is and has always been to liberation and abolitionist struggle, especially in the Black radical tradition. And I realized as well, Miriam Kaba, Dean Spade, and others taught me that a lot of the work that I've been doing over the years is actually mutual aid. I just didn't have the language for it, right? But mutual aid is in most ways the opposite of philanthropy. It means you are down, you are in accountability, you're in collectivity with a group of people. Community, it might be a building, might be an organization, but y'all are helping each other out under the guise of a solidarity and with a politics that is wedded to liberation and transformation. That's mutual aid. Anybody who's listening to this, I guarantee you there is a mutual aid organization or network or practice near you. You could walk to it, bike to it, catch a ride to it if you can, if it's safe for you. Do it. Get involved with mutual aid. It's one of the best ways to be part of this historical record that we've been talking about. And then finally, last thing I've been saying now for about 2 or 3 months, given what is happening in the world, I would not be able to go to sleep tonight without once again saying, all of us have to think really seriously and maybe even in uncomfortable ways about self-defense. They are coming for some of us. This has been made very clear. We need to be busy constructing our own forms of self-defense, whatever ways you are comfortable doing that. I'm not advocating anything illegal. However, for those folks who are comfortable with, legally sanctioned forms of armed self-defense, I encourage firearms training. The shooting range that I've been going to recently here, I've noticed, and it's anecdotal, but it's meaningful. Almost every time I go now, it's overwhelmingly Black folks there with me, right? So you got the one Filipino guy and like 7 Black folks that are there, and it's men, women, children, elders. It's everybody who is there. And it's because I think we share this ethic that because of where we live, we have to be prepared. Now, I'm not saying that's the only way to do armed self-defense. I mean, to do self-defense. Armed self-defense is not the only way. People are doing martial arts. They're doing community networks. They're creating kind of safe havens for each other if there's danger. We got to find ways to to reinvigorate historical self-defense practices right now in 2020, especially in these coming few days, because these folks that we might need to defend ourselves from are not joking around, and so we got to do that. I got to say that.
Yeah, thank you both for those closing thoughts, which are also kind of calls, right? Giving people space to say, you know what, let's do something, right? And so plugging into mutual aid to abolition, to self-defense, to understanding how we reframe and redefine what we understand to be violence and violent, right? So like really understanding, getting into the weeds. And I know that we didn't go into it, but also even understanding, what are we talking about when we say defunding? What are we talking about when we say mass incarceration? What are we talking about when we talk about systems that are violent or oppressive? Like really taking the time to understand that in detail, so that when we're joining in, not only just a roundtable discussion, but when we're joining in any kind of discussion or moving forward in action, we're coming from shared definitions. And I think that that's really critical, because we could all be talking about different things and have very different understandings of what we're trying to do. And so shared definitions are really important. But I want to thank you both, Cheryl, Dr. Rodriguez. Thank you so very much for taking the time to be here. Absolutely. Thank you for accepting the invitation and sharing such wisdom, such treasure on this panel discussion. I'm hoping that everyone that is listening and will listen in the coming days really have some nuggets to take away. And, for all of you that are listening, please stay in contact, please stay in touch. Look up Cheryl Wilkins at Columbia University, Dr. Rodriguez at UC
Riverside.
They have websites and pages and all of those kind of things, contact information. Please get in touch with them. Stay connected to Behind the Walls Between the Lines. And thank y'all so much for attending. Have a great night.
Thank you for
you all.
Work, Felicia.
Thank you. See you on the East Coast.
All right.
Yes, soon.